The war in the Pacific had become a theater of illusions, blood, and despair. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it not only struck the American fleet anchored in Hawaii, it also struck the morale of a nation that, until then, believed it was safe in its oceanic distance. The Japanese Empire expanded like an unstoppable colossus, taking islands, sea lanes, and strategic points with a speed that left the Allies stunned. The fall of the Philippines, the surrender at Wake Island, the advance on Indochina and Malaysia. Each victory reinforced the feeling that the rising sun not only illuminated the Pacific, but dominated it. The Japanese believed they had shaped a new order in which their convoys, heavily escorted by destroyers and cruisers, could cross the seas almost untouched, bringing men, supplies, and confidence to their outposts. This was the illusion that dominated Japanese thinking, an illusion that would be brutally shattered. In early 1942, the United States was still trying to figure out how to confront the enemy in such a vast territory, where every mile of ocean seemed to conspire against Allied logistics. General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific was under constant pressure. His men were resisting in precarious conditions, poorly supplied and often abandoned by the distance that separated the rear from the front. The only way to stop the Japanese advance was to attack the convoys that carried reinforcements and supplies to the garrisons scattered throughout New Guinea and other strategic regions. But there was a simple, yet colossal problem. Traditional methods simply did not work. Heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, climbed to altitudes of 20,000 feet to drop their bombs on enemy ships. From such heights, they relied more on luck than on accuracy. Half-ton bombs plunged kilometers through the air and, at the last moment, were avoided by Japanese captains who skillfully turned their rudders. The ocean exploded in columns of water, but the ships continued their journey, intact and mocking the American effort. It was like trying to hit a bird in flight by throwing stones from a cliff. The failure was repeated, convoy after convoy, shipment after shipment. The Japanese, observing the poor results, consolidated their belief that they were safe. Their convoys were like mobile fortresses, guarded by destroyers and the technological incompetence of the Americans in hitting them effectively. This false sense of invulnerability, however, hid a deadly trap. Japan believed that the Pacific War at sea would follow the manuals, that planes were for attacking planes, and ships for fighting ships. There was no room in their rigid doctrinaire mindset for tactical innovation that broke all the rules. On the American side, on the other hand, desperation bred creativity. The engineers, mechanics, and pilots of the 5th Air Force began to realize that it was not enough to insist on what did not work. It was necessary to invent something that the enemy could not predict, something that would transform medium bombers, despised for their inability to compete with the giant B-17s, into instruments of naval destruction capable of sweeping decks and piercing hulls. This is where the narrative intensifies, as the scenario in 1942 was fraught with tension and humiliation. The Japanese advanced with almost no resistance, sending convoys of 8, 10, 12 ships loaded with soldiers and equipment. For each reinforced garrison, the cost in American and Australian lives grew. For each shipment of ammunition unloaded in New Guinea, the enemy's resistance power multiplied. And for each convoy that arrived intact at its destination, the morale of the Allied soldiers plummeted. The war was turning into an asymmetrical game. On one side, Japan, with protected sea lanes. On the other, the United States and its allies stuck with a tactic that simply wasn't working. It was in this cauldron of despair that a new weapon was about to be born, forged not in laboratories or large factories, but in the makeshift workshops of men who would not accept defeat as an answer. For the Japanese, each successful convoy was confirmation that they were right. They saw the Allied bombers in the sky and smiled, certain that the rain of bombs would fall far away, exploding in the open sea. For them, it was almost a spectacle. The arrogance of believing that the Americans would never find an effective way to interrupt the vital flow of troops and supplies. But this blind confidence, fueled by the repetition of others' mistakes, was also a slow poison. With each ship that crossed the Pacific unscathed, the Japanese delved deeper into the illusion that they were invincible. An illusion that would make them wish for their own death when they discovered that, behind the initial failure, a metallic fury armed with 1450 caliber machine guns was silently growing, just waiting for the moment to awaken. The Pacific, at that time, was more than an ocean. It was a huge chessboard where mobility decided the survival of empires. Whoever controlled the sea lanes would control the fate of the war. Japan knew this and invested everything in its escorted merchant marine. The United States also knew this, but did not yet have the right pieces on the board. When a Japanese convoy reached its destination, it was not just a group of ships docking at a port. It was a living demonstration that the balance of power still leaned toward the enemy. With each landing of fresh soldiers, the hope of containing the Japanese tide diminished. With each box of ammunition unloaded, an Allied soldier died sooner in some jungle. The war was not decided solely by grandiose naval battles, but by these logistical details, invisible to the public, but fatal to those fighting in the trenches and forests. And it was precisely this invisible machinery that needed to be broken. While the Japanese sank into their arrogance, the American reality was one of pure urgency. There was no time for lengthy studies or formal projects that would take years. The need was immediate. Stop convoys now. Prevent reinforcements from arriving tomorrow. Save the front line the next day. It was in this clash between Japan's blind confidence and the desperate creativity of the United States that the seed of transformation emerged. And that transformation had a name, although few knew it yet. The B-25 Mitchell, the medium bomber that the enemy underestimated, about to become the nightmare of the seas. The contrast between these two worlds, that of Japanese certainty and that of American necessity, sets the stage for what was to come. For if, to the Japanese, medium bombers were just distant figures on the horizon, incapable of hitting a moving target, they would soon see those same aircraft appear a few meters above the waves, spitting fire with 14 heavy machine guns, sweeping decks, and silencing the laughter of sailors who once mocked air attacks. It was the harbinger of a historic turnaround, the harbinger of a new kind of war, and, above all, the harbinger of an encounter with death that the Japanese would never forget. In that scenario of defeat and humiliation, in the midst of a war that seemed to be leaning toward the Japanese side, an unlikely man emerged. Paul Irving, Pappy Gunn, was not a general, nor was he an engineer trained at renowned academies. He was a mechanic, a self-taught man who learned to fly planes with the stubbornness of someone who refused to accept the limitations that fate tried to impose on him. Born in Quitman, Arkansas, in 1899, he dropped out of school in 6th grade. He had no diplomas or titles. What he did have was a practical mind, calloused hands, and an unusual ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. It was this combination of simplicity and genius that would transform him into a legendary figure of the Pacific War. His trajectory up to that point seemed, in itself, a prelude to the war to come. As a teenager, he joined the Navy, dreaming of becoming a pilot. Without the formal education necessary to become an officer, he was destined to be a mechanic. There he learned every detail of aircraft engines, fuselages, and systems. For years, he served on pioneering aircraft carriers such as the USS Langley, the Lexington, and the Saratoga. He flew when he could, always as part of the small elite group of enlisted pilots, a rare group that learned on the job, not from manuals. Later, in civilian life, he used his savings to buy planes and found a small airline in the Philippines. Philippine Airlines. It was a simple life, built with sweat, alongside his wife Polly and their 4 children. The dream of a man who seemed to have distanced himself from war. But then came December 1941, and with it the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, followed by the invasion of the Philippines. Poppy Gunn saw his family imprisoned in Manila, sent to the Santo Tomas internment camp, while he himself fled to Australia, along with American military personnel who managed to escape. At that moment, he ceased to be just a mechanic and became something greater. Japan had taken his home, his business, and separated his family. What remained was a silent fury and an absolute determination to fight back. Every action from then on would be marked by this mixture of personal revenge and improvised genius. He was a man with nothing to lose and an entire war to win. Upon joining the United States Army Air Corps, he was commissioned as a captain and soon showed what he was capable of. For him, it made no sense to continue sending heavy bombers to safe altitudes, from where they dropped ineffective bombs. It was necessary to get close, so close that gunfire and explosions were inevitable. The very idea of the bomber had to be transformed. The war manuals did not foresee this, but Poppy was not a man of manuals. He thought like a mechanic. If the plane did not serve its purpose, it was enough to dismantle it, adapt it, and reinvent it. That's how he came up with the idea of transforming the B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber often considered secondary to the B-17, into an unprecedented naval destruction machine. The B-25 had ideal characteristics: enough speed to escape fighters, range to cover the vast Pacific, and a robust structure capable of withstanding modifications. Gunn began by removing the conventional bombing equipment, eliminating the nose gunner's role, and replacing it with rows of 50 caliber machine guns. Initially, there were 4, then 6. Before long, there were 14 heavy machine guns pointing forward, transforming the aircraft into a veritable fire-spitting steel scythe. It was as if 3 P-51 Mustang fighters had been compressed into a single fuselage, concentrating firepower in bursts that could sweep the deck of a destroyer in seconds. The Japanese did not yet know it, but this simple adaptation would forever change their notion of safety at sea. But it was not enough to equip the planes with weapons. A new way of attacking had to be created. That's when Poppy Gunn embraced a technique called skip bombing, which until then had been almost experimental. The principle was simple but daring. Fly just 50 feet above the sea surface, drop 500-pound bombs so that they ricocheted off the water like skipping stones, hitting the sides of ships just above the waterline, at their most vulnerable point. Meanwhile, nose machine guns cleared the way, sweeping away entire crews of enemy sailors attempting to operate anti-aircraft guns. The synergy was perfect. Machine guns prevented defense, while bombs did the final job. The result would be devastating. The modification process, however, was anything but orthodox. Gunn and his team improvised in the 5th Air Force workshops, often dismantling planes destroyed in combat to salvage usable machine guns. They installed them in the B-25s without formal approval, adjusting mounts and alignments by force, using reused and adapted parts. It was almost an act of organized rebellion, but a necessary one. When the first prototypes appeared, there were those who doubted. Many officers questioned whether it was safe to fly so low, whether it was efficient to risk the lives of entire crews in attacks that seemed suicidal. But Poppy knew that nothing could be more suicidal than insisting on ineffective bombing that had no impact on the enemy. For him, taking risks was inevitable. Wasting time was unforgivable. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, soon realized the genius of what was being done. Instead of reprimanding Gunn for violating rules and standards, he gave him carte blanche to modify as many bombers as necessary. The logic was clear. Either they innovated now, or they would be defeated. The war left no time for academic debates. Action was needed. In a short time, entire squadrons of modified B-25s were ready. The pilots began training in the new tactic, flying close to the sea, adjusting their instincts, learning to endure the terror of facing Japanese destroyers head-on. The training was not only technical, it was psychological. It was necessary to teach men to fight in a way that defied all sense of self-preservation, flying low enough to feel the waves splashing against the fuselage. On the other side, Japan continued to believe in its invulnerability. Its commanders were convinced that Allied bombers could only attack in the traditional manner, from high altitude, and that their naval escorts were sufficient to repel any threat. This blind confidence would be their undoing. For when Poppy Gunn's B-25s appeared on the horizon, spitting fire with 14.50 caliber machine guns and dropping bombs that bounced on the waves, no naval doctrine could save them. They were about to face a weapon that did not appear in any war manual, born of one man's anger and an army's desperate need. It was the beginning of a silent revolution that would soon roar with the deafening noise of thousands of shots per minute. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be underestimated. For the Japanese, it would be a shock to discover that medium-sized aircraft, previously ridiculed as ineffective against ships, were now transformed into ruthless, low-flying predators, spitting heavy bullets and exploding bombs right at the waterline. For the Americans, it meant something even deeper. Proof that they were not defeated. That improvisation and courage could overcome the rigidity and blind confidence of the enemy. It was as much a cultural change as a military one, and perhaps it was this change that set the stage for what would happen in March 1943. When the Japanese finally realized, too late, that every convoy launched into the sea could be a death sentence for thousands of men. This was the birth of fury. A medium bomber turned into a flying gunboat, a rebellious mind that dared to reinvent warfare, and a nation willing to risk everything to avoid losing the Pacific. Japan, unaware, was heading straight for an encounter with a weapon that forgave no mistakes. From that moment on, every enemy ship that left Rabaul or any other port carried with it the shadow of an omen, to encounter in the skies not only airplanes, but the deadly roar of 14.50 machine guns ready to tear through steel, wood, and men. Their fate was sealed. And if you want to continue exploring stories that reveal hidden and fascinating aspects of World War II, make sure you subscribe to the channel and listen carefully to this detail. The philosophy of destruction that was born with Poppy Gun's modifications was not just a technical change. It was a true revolution in thinking. Until then, air warfare manuals dictated that bombers should operate safely at high altitudes, from where they could attack targets without exposing themselves to enemy fire. This doctrine came from Europe, where entire cities were bombed by formations of heavy bombers, and where fixed targets justified the natural inaccuracy of bombs dropped from high altitudes. But in the Pacific, the reality was different. The enemy was not only fixed, it moved. These were fast, agile ships, capable of changing course in seconds and escaping the bombs that fell from miles above. Poppy Gun understood something that few officers were willing to admit. There was no point in insisting on old formulas that had already proven useless. It was necessary to throw away the manuals and write new rules, even if those rules required risking everything. This new philosophy was based on a simple and terrifying principle. If you want to sink a ship, you have to face it head-on. Not from 6,000 meters up, but 15 meters above the waves. This meant entering the maximum range of anti-aircraft weapons, exposing yourself to machine gun and naval cannon fire, and flying so low that water could splash on the cockpit glass. It was a philosophy that turned every attack into a duel of courage. For American pilots, it was like being thrown into death on every mission. For the Japanese, it was an unexpected nightmare, something for which they had no training or strategy. For when they saw medium bombers appear on the horizon, they expected the old routine: ineffective bombs that could be avoided with agile maneuvers. What they could not imagine was that these same bombers would now skim the waves, spitting fire from 14.50 machine guns, and throwing bombs that bounced on the surface until they buried themselves in the steel flanks. The skip bombing method required almost superhuman precision. The pilot had to calculate the exact moment to release the bomb, so that it would hit the water at the right angle and continue on until it hit the ship. A mistake of seconds meant that the bomb could explode prematurely, bounce off course, or even collide harmlessly with the hull without causing damage. It required training, nerves of steel, and an almost blind confidence in one's own instincts. But when it worked, the effect was devastating. A 500-pound bomb, hitting the hull at its most vulnerable point, could split a ship in half. And while that was happening, the B-25's nose machine guns swept the decks, killing gunners before they could react, silencing guns that could bring down the attackers. It was a macabre choreography in which each element played a role. The plane was not just a bomber or a fighter. It was both at the same time, a deadly hybrid that the enemy simply did not know how to deal with. This transformation also exposed a profound contrast between two military cultures. The Japanese were known for their strict discipline, for strictly following doctrines studied for years. Their officers believed that every threat could be predicted and every attack contained, as long as defense manuals were followed. The Americans, on the other hand, used improvisation as a weapon. While Japan relied on crystallized doctrines, the United States relied on the creativity of men like Gunn, capable of ignoring rules and creating solutions in the heat of necessity. This difference would prove decisive. When the B-25s began attacking with their new tactics, the Japanese had no way to respond. Their destroyers were prepared for high-altitude bombers with batteries of cannons pointing skyward. They were not ready to face planes that appeared almost at wave level, firing thousands of projectiles per minute. There was no training for that. There was no doctrine for that. There was only death coming fast, without warning, without any way to avoid it. For American pilots, however, the experience was anything but simple. Flying so low was almost suicidal. Each mission became a test of courage. They described the feeling of seeing the masts of ships approaching the cockpit, of feeling the air vibrating with the explosion of their own bombs. They knew that any mistake would be fatal. But they also knew that, unlike high-altitude missions, they now had a real chance of causing serious damage. The psychological difference was brutal. Before, they returned from missions frustrated, knowing that their efforts had been futile. Now, they returned knowing that they had sunk ships, destroyed convoys, changed the course of the battle. This renewed confidence was as powerful a weapon as the machine guns that equipped their planes. The enemy, in turn, was beginning to feel the weight of this change. Reports from surviving Japanese sailors describe the feeling of absolute terror at seeing bombers appearing so low on the horizon. It was not just the deafening noise of the engines, but the constant roar of machine guns spitting fire. It was the sound of death arriving at full speed. Many sailors did not even have time to run to their positions. Others, when they managed to do so, were killed in seconds, swept away by bursts that turned the deck into a field of bodies. The few who survived told of bombs that bounced like stones on the sea, only to crash into the hulls with relentless force. For them, the sight of the B-25s was an omen of doom, a cruel reminder that the war had changed. And there was something even more disturbing about this new form of combat: the proximity. From 20,000 feet up, killing was an abstraction. The bombs fell and the targets exploded in the distance, invisible, almost impersonal. But low altitude did not offer that emotional distance. The pilots could see the enemy sailors at their posts. They could see their terrified faces. They could witness the bodies being thrown into the sea. The war became visceral, immediate, almost intimate. Each burst of gunfire was not against a ship, but against flesh and blood men, visible a few meters away. This left its mark on those who attacked, but it also made victory more concrete. There was no doubt about the results. Each mission left ships in flames, hulls broken, survivors desperate. It was war in its rawest and most direct form. Critics might say that this was a suicidal tactic, exposing the planes to unnecessary risks. And indeed, the losses were real. Many crew members never returned, shot down by a hail of anti-aircraft fire before they could drop their bombs. But for Gunn and those who believed in his vision, the balance was still favorable. It was better to lose a few planes and sink entire ships than to spare the crews and allow thousands of enemy soldiers to reach the front. It was cruel math, but war offered no gentle alternatives. In the end, each successful attack saved thousands of Allied lives in future battles. The risk was enormous, but the result was undeniable. This philosophy, which combined improvisation and brutality, showed Japan that its arrogance was a deadly mistake. Until then, they believed that the seas were theirs, that their convoys could cross the Pacific in relative safety. But the fury of 14.50 caliber machine guns showed that there was no longer any refuge. From the moment the B-25s began hunting ships, each crossing became a game of chance. The enemy could no longer rely on routine, could no longer predict attacks. Now, on every horizon, there was the risk of encountering planes skimming the waves, spitting fire, and dropping bombs that destroyed entire ships in seconds. It was this uncertainty, this fear, that began to erode Japanese confidence. It was the beginning of an irreversible change. Japan did not yet know it, but its days of naval supremacy were numbered. Unlike battles between large fleets, which depended on months of planning, this new form of attack was fast, unpredictable, and devastating. Convoys, once signs of strength, became easy targets, and little by little, the tide began to turn. It was not just a change in tactics, it was the birth of a new era of aerial warfare, in which manuals were torn up and replaced by creativity and fury. It was proof that, in war, innovation always speaks louder than tradition. Thus, the philosophy of destruction created by Poppy Gunn and his men not only changed the way planes attacked ships, but also exposed the vulnerability of an entire empire. The Japanese did not yet know it, but each new convoy launched into the sea was, in fact, heading toward its own demise. For now, the Pacific was no longer theirs. It was the territory of bombers that glided over the waves like predators, armed to the teeth, ready to turn enemy arrogance into shipwrecks and flames. The fate was already written, and the waters of the Bismarck Sea would soon become the stage for one of the most brutal lessons Japan would learn throughout the war. The dawn of March 3, 1943, brought with it a deceptive silence over the Bismarck Sea. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, it would be just another routine day. 8 transports loaded with nearly 7,000 soldiers, escorted by 8 destroyers, sailed confidently toward Lae, New Guinea. For them, this operation was just one of many, a crucial reinforcement to consolidate positions and sustain the Japanese presence in the Pacific. Convinced that they were protected by the experience of their escorts and the historical ineffectiveness of Allied bombing, they believed they would reach their destination, as they had so many times before. They did not know, however, that that morning would be the scene of an unprecedented clash, and that in just 15 minutes, their convictions would be shattered along with their ships. On the horizon, dark spots began to approach. Initially, Japanese lookouts believed they were American medium bombers preparing for another traditional attack, with bombs dropped from high altitudes. It was almost a common sight, arousing more contempt than fear. But that perception vanished in seconds. The planes were flying low, very low, almost touching the waves. And before any reaction was possible, the air was filled with the deafening roar of dozens of .50 caliber machine guns firing in unison. Each B-25 spat fire from 14 mouths, and the sky turned into a wall of bullets sweeping across the Japanese decks. The attack was so sudden and so brutal that most of the enemy garrisons did not have time to reach their positions. Men were torn apart in their own anti-aircraft towers before they even fired a shot. Entire crews were thrown into the sea by uninterrupted bursts of fire, and the ships, which had previously seemed like fortresses, became death traps for their occupants. In less than a minute, Japanese confidence evaporated. They realized with horror that they were no longer facing predictable bombers, but aerial predators that came to kill at close range, leaving no room for defense. It was the cruel revelation of the fury of the B-25's 14.50 machine guns. But the firestorm was not yet over. As the bombers drew even closer, the pilots dropped their 500-pound bombs at low altitude. The bombs skipped across the water like stones thrown by giants, bouncing over the waves until they embedded themselves in the hulls of the transports and destroyers. The ensuing explosions split ships in half, tore off gun turrets, and opened craters in the sides of the vessels. Each impact was accompanied by columns of water and fire rising into the air, mixing smoke, oil, and screams. The technique of skip bombing, considered too risky by many conservative officers, proved its deadly effectiveness at that moment. The Japanese tried to react. Some destroyers maneuvered desperately, firing at the bombers that passed close to their masts. But the relentless bursts from the B-25s quickly silenced any resistance. The anti-aircraft guns were silenced one by one, and the decks, once filled with soldiers ready for defense, became scenes of chaos and despair. The attack was so close, so personal, that American pilots could see Japanese sailors running in panic, trying to escape the hell that consumed them. There was no time for orders, no doctrine that could save the fleet. There was only death, spreading with every passing second. In just 15 minutes, the fate of the entire Japanese operation was sealed. 8 transports were destroyed. 4 destroyers lay sunk or in flames. Of the nearly 7,000 soldiers on board, less than 1,200 would reach their destination alive, many of them wounded or adrift, clinging to debris. The Bismarck Sea had become a floating graveyard, a scene of destruction so complete that it seemed to have been written by divine hands, as if the ocean itself had turned against the empire of the rising sun. For the Japanese, it was more than a military defeat. It was the revelation that they were no longer fighting the same war. The strategic impact was immediate. From that day on, the Imperial Navy never again attempted to send large convoys through the Bismarck Sea. The boldness of Papigun and his converted aircraft had redefined the rules of the conflict. Japan, which until then believed itself to be the master of the seas, now saw its supply routes cut off by aircraft that appeared out of nowhere, impossible to stop, lethal in their simplicity. The battle showed that creativity and adaptation could destroy even a seemingly invincible enemy. It was a turning point, a point at which Japanese confidence began to crumble, and the tide of war slowly began to turn. More than ships, the B-25 sank the very illusion of Japanese supremacy. What happened that day was not just an American victory. It was a brutal message that the war had changed forever. The Japanese wished for their own demise by underestimating the enemy's ability to reinvent itself, believing that old methods would always guarantee their safety. They learned, in the most painful way, that arrogance is a death sentence when confronted with innovation and fury. And perhaps that is the most powerful reflection left by this battle. That 15 minutes can change the course of a war. 15 minutes were enough to turn steel ships into wreckage, to turn confident soldiers into drifting ghosts, to show that no strategy is eternal when human creativity decides to challenge the rules. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was not just another chapter in World War II. It was a turning point that proved, in fire and blood, that there is no ultimate weapon, only minds capable of seeing the impossible. What do you think could have been different that day? Was there anything the Japanese could have done to change their fate? Or was the outcome already sealed the moment they underestimated the enemy? Leave your opinion in the comments, because your perspective may bring new angles to our understanding of this decisive episode. If you liked this content, like, share, and subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Thank you for watching,